And if it in
Well, at the stroke of the clock, good afternoon.
So we'd like you to go to the podium as usual.
Okay.
Sorry about that. That's where the camera is set, so.
Oh, so I go there too?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Good afternoon. I'm Susan Pharr, and I was formerly director of the USGF program, and I'm delighted to be moderator for today. Welcome back from the spring break. I hope you're all very refreshed. There is the proverb, April showers, spring May flowers. So hopefully it's starting a little bit early, remains leading to a beautiful May. So the seminar today is co-sponsored by the Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies, the Korea Institute, the Fairbanks Center of Chinese Studies, and the Harvard University Asia Center. And a variety of programs who are co-sponsors of this event tell you how broad are the interests of our speaker today and of interest to a great many people around the world. Our speaker is Margarita Estévez-Abe, who is professor of political science at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Policy at Syracuse University. At Syracuse, she's also director of their Center for European Studies. She's very well known to us at Harvard because she was a professor here, a postdoc in the U.S. Japan program, had many relations with our program. She grew up in Japan, went to Keio University, received her bachelor's and her master's from Keio, and then she entered the PhD program at Harvard. And it was my privilege to serve as chair of her dissertation committee. And she went on from there to her first academic post at the University of Minnesota. And then from there, she was invited back to Harvard to join the faculty. On the faculty here, she was a very dynamic lecturer, a very major popular figure among students, and very admired by her colleagues. And we were sad to see her go to Syracuse University, but she has been really very successful in her career there, and we're very proud of everything she's achieved. Along the way, in 2012 to 14, she was on a leave from Syracuse at a research institute in Turin, Italy, called the Collegio Carlo Mario. And she was very much valued as a expert on policy over a 2-year period and held a professorship there. I visited her at a workshop, and I can tell you that she was a very important figure for that institution over the period she was there. Margarita is a distinguished scholar of comparative political science. And I think what it makes her completely unique or certainly quite distinctive in the field of Japanese studies is that she's a native speaker of Spanish and Japanese, and she speaks English beautifully, but she has a deep expertise in Western Europe. And at the same time, she has broad ties within East Asia and has a real command of the different social welfare systems in countries in East Asia. So she has that kind of background. She's the author of an outstanding book called Welfare Capitalism in Post-War Japan, Party Bureaucracy and Business, which won the 2009 Ohira Memorial Prize. Our presentation today comes from a book that is nearing completion called Citizenship, Family, and Patriarchy, Marriage Migrants in East Asian Democracies. So let me now turn things over with great pleasure to Margarita.
Thank you so much for Susan's very generous introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me. And it's just so nice to be back here and see my old professor, sort of friends and colleagues. So today I'm, as Susan mentioned, today I'm sort of presenting part of my sort of book manuscript on married to migrants in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. I've been having a hard time deciding on the title. Initially, the working title was Globalizing the Family. Globalization is a term that has gone out of fashion. Now I have gender, and now I'm just worried about just having gender in the title, just in case many public universities might not be able to purchase my book. So I'm still brainstorming about what I should do. Oops. Okay. So I must say that I'm not a scholar of migration. So I have to just, say a few words about why I'm not a scholar of migration, or why am I doing a book on migration. Susan has generously introduced me as a comparative politics scholar who works on Western Europe and East Asia. So what's really interesting for me was that as America and many European countries are turning away from immigration, East Asian countries are trying to embrace it. And it's very interesting that we all know that East Asian countries, especially countries like Japan and Korea, have been known for a very long time for their wariness about foreigners and immigration. Japan, still politicians don't want to use the word immigration. But then East Asia's aging so fast. I guess to this group, I don't even have to talk about that. But in the Japanese case, Japan is a super aged, the oldest, demographically speaking, the oldest country in the whole world, where almost 1 in 10 people are aged 80 and up. And Korea and Taiwan are catching up very, very fast. So all these countries are starting to rely heavily on foreign workers. So again, I'm not a scholar of migration, but I am very interested in the political economy of demographic aging. I'm very interested in how countries that are aging so fast, how they can cope with this. But in this book, I'm going a bit out of my comfort zone because in this book, I'm not studying about migration in ways that political economy scholars typically do. But I'm just trying to understand how these ethnically homogeneous, relatively close countries change to integrate immigrants. Because I think that in order for these countries to do that, they have to change their idea of national identity and nationhood. And whether they can change or not, they are just critical ramifications for the sustainability of their economy and also society. So when the Japanese press or scholars talk about immigration in Japan these days, they kind of look up to Korea as a model. So many people in Japan, or just newspaper articles, you can just find just lots of articles about the Korean case. And the general tone is that Korea is much more advanced than Japan is in integrating immigrants and embracing labor migration. And the tone is that Japan has to just learn from the Korean example. And in fact, when we just look at international data, such as the Migration Integration Policy Index, Korea's overall score is slightly higher than Japan's. And while Japan overhauled its labor migration system in 2018, Korea had already done that in 2004. In the case of Taiwan, Taiwan embraced labor migration as early as 1991. Korea also is just often talked about for its various integration programs, immigration integration programs, that Japan doesn't have. So on paper, Korea appears as the vanguard of immigration in East Asia. But my research kind of has a counterintuitive finding, which is that on a closer look, Japan actually doesn't look too bad. And so that's a counterintuitive finding, and it comes with a twist. I'm just going to keep the twist to the very end. So I will just warn you, I am not saying that Japan is a fantastic place for immigrants. My comparison is limited to East Asian countries. So I am not comparing Japan to Germany or Britain or to the US. I am comparing Japan to Korea and Taiwan. And then I focus on marriage migrants, specifically sort of Filipino marriage migrants. And I do this for a reason. So these are societies that have been ethnically homogeneous. Even when they opened up for labor migration, they were not open for immigration. We can just see this in a country like Taiwan. So the first group of non-co-ethnic foreigners who have been allowed to settle in these countries are marriage migrants. And there is a very gender-skewed pattern in this too. About 80% of cross-border marriages that involve Japanese citizens are between Japanese men and foreign women, most of them from less affluent parts of Asia. And when we just move to Korea and Taiwan, the figure goes up to 90%. So these countries, the first group of non-co-ethnic foreigners that have been allowed to settle are not just marriage migrants, but foreign wives of male citizens. And what I just do in this work is to compare the experiences of Filipino wives in 3 East Asian cases and explain their experiences based on the institutional and legal differences in the 3 countries. Institutions and laws concerning labor migration rules, citizenship, they give a tangible way for us to understand how these states define who can be members of their societies and who will receive what kind of rights. So this really just provides good insights into understanding how the nationhood is defined in these countries and how it might be changing. And I use a term, de jure and de facto citizenship. So de jure citizenship is whether you can naturalize and become a citizen, but de facto citizenship is kind of your everyday lived experience. And in thinking about, in sort of comparing these sort of 3 countries, the Filipino wives' experiences in these 3 countries, I just break down this de facto citizenship into 3 dimensions of autonomy, as I call them. So the first is their ability to stay in the country after marital dissolution. The husband dies or they get divorced. The second dimension of autonomy is economic independence. So this is the Filipino wives' ability to sustain themselves. The third is a cultural autonomy. So this is the Filipino wives' ability to pass their own culture to their children or shape the family life, bring their culture into the family life. Okay, so I don't want to just spend too much time on this because I think this audience, you're just all very familiar with the basic sort of demographic trends in these sort of 3 countries. This just includes China too. But what you're just seeing here is the decline in the fertility rate. So this is Japan. The decline just started early, and it's more gradual. And you can just see how Korea and Taiwan and China are going through the same kind of demographic aging even more rapidly. So this is just to reduce the number of sort of slides. So this only just shows you the Japanese case, but this is just similar in other East Asian countries too. So men are having a harder time just getting married. So this is, you could just see that in Japan, so men between 50 and 54 have just never, more than 20% of them have just never been married. The same figure is just much lower than women. So you just get an idea why the cross-border marriages in these countries are gender skewed, because men are the ones who are just having more trouble in the domestic sort of marriage market. And they have just looked into to women from other countries, just particularly poorer regions of Asia. So I'm just looking at Filipinas. So just let me just give you just some basic stats on the Filipinas. So until Chinese wives surpassed, Filipinas used to be the biggest group of foreign wives in Japan. In Korea, so Filipinas were just about 80.6% of married migrants into the mid until 2015. And then Vietnamese, Thai women just started to just come in. So the Filipinas overall sort of ranking has just gone down. And in Taiwan, so the Filipinas are the 5th largest Southeast Asian sort of wives. And both in Korea and Taiwan, the biggest groups of married migrants are co-ethnics. So in Taiwan, just most of the wives come from mainland China. In the case of Korea, most of the wives just come from China, but many of them are Korean ethnics. So in the case of Japan, it's different. The co-ethnics don't play a big role in the cross-border marriage pattern. Okay, so I won't just spend too much time on this. But basically, there are just lots of studies about married migrants in Japan and East Asia, but most of the studies have been done by ethnographers. So they might be anthropologists, sociologists, and very few studies engage in systematic comparisons. And so recently, some sort of quantitative studies just started to emerge because Korea and Taiwanese governments do periodic surveys of married migrants. So there's data, but in Japan, such data doesn't exist. Okay, so there are sort of lots of studies of married migrants. How do we study married migrants sort of differently? So what I do is this sort of systematic comparison. And I have conducted sort of surveys in 3 places: Fujisawa City in Japan, Seoul in Korea, and Taipei in Taiwan. And so I just do some sort of statistical analysis sort of based on this sort of micro level data. But what I do is I just use the data to just come up with the differences in the performance of Filipinas on the 3 dimensions of autonomies that I mentioned earlier, and try to explain those differences in terms of institutional sort of differences across the 3 countries. And again, there is a methodological reason why I focus on the Filipinas. I just wanted to just look at a group of women who did not share any cultural or linguistic proximity to the host countries. And also Filipinas is very well organized because the Filipino government, the government of the Philippines takes a great interest in their overseas citizens because they vote and they send remittances. So there's a very close working relationship between the Filipino embassy and many of the grassroots organizations of Filipinas, which just made it just very easy for us to reach out to them and survey them. And just comparing these sort of three countries is also gives me a nice sort of analytical leverage, because these just three cases are very similar cases. Most of the migration scholars would categorize them as belonging to this very restrictive immigration regime they call East Asia model. And I also just look into the impact of the welfare state on these women and on the welfare state too. Welfare state scholars just oftentimes sort of lump together these countries as belonging to a similar type of sort of welfare state. So these are the 1 and 2 are the similarities. So these countries, they share similar sort of legal traditions of patrilineal familialist tradition. And also for a very long time, they just also share sort of ethno-nationalist sort of citizenship regime. So these two things are just highlighted in most literature, categorizing these three countries as belonging to the same model of sort of immigration regimes. I look at differences in other sort of institutional features. So labor migration rules. So these countries, okay, so they're slightly different when it comes to labor migration rules. Taiwan has been much more open to labor migration than Korea and Japan. More recently, Korea has just become open to labor migration, but here, being open to labor migration doesn't mean that these countries are like Southern European countries. These countries do manage where people can come from, so there's a lot of control over who comes in and for what duration. Even for that, Japan used to be just much more limited. So in Japan, labor migration when it becomes more overhauled and becomes really just come to the front of sort of politics as late as 2018. Because I'm just studying sort of Filipinas, I'm just also just looking at sort of different labor migration rules that affected Filipinas. So in Taiwan, in this labor migration rules, only a handful of Southeast Asian countries are allowed to send their workers to Taiwan. And there are specific categories of work that these people can do. Factory jobs, jobs as domestic and care workers, these are jobs that are open to Filipinas. So they do have a lot of choice. And by 2015, if you were a domestic worker in Taiwan, you could stay in Taiwan up to 14 years. So yes, you're still a temporary worker and you have to leave when the employment contract is over, but the duration, it's just, they can just stay and work legally in Taiwan up to 14 years. Japan and Korea are not that generous. So job opportunities for Filipinas in South Korea was very limited. South Korea opens up to foreign workers, guest workers in 2004, but Korea earmarked some jobs for co-ethnics. So for Filipinas, women from Philippines, the only option of work in Korea would be to work in factories. But Korean employers would typically prefer men, so they might hire Filipino men, but no women. Japan was close to the labor migration for a very long time. They would only allow a certain types of skilled foreigners to come in, and entertainers. These entertainer visas are for foreign performers, musicians, dancers, and Japan considered these jobs to be the sort of skilled jobs. So Filipinas did qualify to come into Japan as entertainers, but these were just extremely short duration visas. So these are the differences. And these differences actually matter in the path just migratory pathways of Filipina wives. And another way in which the three countries just differed was, on the paper, it really just looks like Taiwan and Korea are very kind and caring sort of governments. They have institutionalized all kinds of programs for marriage migrants. But I can't just go into it in my presentation. I can just talk more about this during Q&A. In Korea and Taiwan, the rights of these marriage migrants are very tied to their roles, their reproductive roles. Their roles are wives and mothers of citizens. So the way in which these governments intervene is they just want to ensure that these foreign wives, especially from Southeast Asia, are good mothers, and their offspring attain more or less the same quality as the native Taiwanese or Korean kids. So I call this patriarchal citizenship, patriarchal sort of multiculturalism. In contrast, the Japanese state shows no interest in marriage migrants or their children. And this is just very interesting because in Korea, children of these cross-border marriages are called multicultural children. Cross-border, so couples where the husband is Korean and the wife is Filipina or Vietnamese, the government calls these families multicultural families. So on the surface, the government is admitting that the Korean family has now been internationalized, but at the same time, the government singles them out. In Taiwan, it's the same thing, that the foreign wives are called new Taiwanese, and their children are also sort of new Taiwanese. So there is an official term to describe these children. Japan doesn't have these terms. So the government doesn't really, there's no official language to describe these families. There's no official description of children from these mixed sort of marriages. As far as the Japanese government is concerned, if someone has a Japanese father, the child is Japanese. It's just black and white. And even when the mother is Japanese, because the nationality law has changed in the mid-80s, if the child carries a Japanese name and has a Japanese passport, that child is Japanese. It's just black and white. There are no the government does not admit that there are multicultural children. But when the Japanese government uses multicultural children, the government is referring to children who reside in Japan, whose parents are both foreign nationals. So there's quite a sort of difference between the three countries. So it's always Korea and Taiwan more similar than Japan. Because in these sort of three countries, traditionally, daughters-in-law have been expected to carry out the unpaid care work for the in-laws. I also just look into the structure of the long-term elder care. And again, I may not just have time, so I can just come back to this, but just let me just say that the Japanese sort of welfare system reduces the burden on the daughters-in-law than it's the case in Taiwan and Korea, and I can just say more about this. So the picture is just like this. Okay, so I didn't explain this, but so embedded patriarchy actually reduces the autonomy of marriage migrants. And so the labor migration rules are just very important because in Korea, Filipinas didn't have access to the labor market in Korea, whereas Filipinas had access to the labor market in Japan and Taiwan. So in those cases, those women come into the country and meet their husbands. Whereas in the Korean case, Filipinas didn't have access to the labor market in Korea. So when they come into Korea as foreign brides, most of them meet their husbands through marriage brokers. And how they come in also affect their experience once they're in the country. So this is a just quick way of just looking at how the marriage migrants first came in to the country. In Japan, it was work, most of them as entertainers. In Taiwan, most of them just came into Taiwan for work. Most of them just worked in factories. Very few Filipinas married to Koreans just came into the country for work. And many of them just came because of marriage. So how did these sort of Filipinos meet their husbands? You could just see that, so in Japan and Taiwan, they just met their future husbands through work. And also, they were just more likely to meet their future husbands through sort of friends network. In Korea, because Filipinas did not have access to the labor market in Korea, just most of them just came through commercial brokers and church. This is not Catholic Church. This is Unification Church, which functions as matchmakers. And in terms of the education, Filipinas more or less look similar in all three countries. And these are not the poorest of the poor women, but most of them are actually college educated. And oftentimes they're more educated than their husbands. So it's not just quite the kind of the global hypergamy that you might just think of. And so this, in 30 minutes, I may not be able to just do this, but so the structure of the elderly care actually matters. And especially whether the government gives cash benefits to families. So when the government gives, so in Japan, the government only provides service in kind. So long-term care insurance only pays for benefits in kind. It doesn't give you cash benefits. In Korea, long-term care insurance does provide cash benefits to the family. So when this happens, basically, so in Korea, this happens when it's difficult for families to access care. And unlike in Japan, in Korea, most of the providers are for-profit providers. So they don't want to take on difficult elderly with dementia or people who just need a lot of care. So the structure of the welfare system kind of just affects this. And in Korea, we just see a much higher incidence of Filipinas engaged in unpaid care. So this, just also just affects their sort of economic independence. But just let me just sort of show you this de jure citizenship. So this is Japan, this is South Korea, that's Taiwan. Orange is permanent resident, gray is naturalized citizen, blue is people who are on sort of spouse visa. And what's really remarkable is in Korea, most of the Filipino wives, overwhelming majority of them have already been naturalized. In Japan, in contrast, so few of them have been naturalized. Most of them are permanent resident. Why? Korea now permits dual citizenship. So Filipinas can naturalize and keep their Filipino passports too. In Japan and Taiwan, they cannot do that. But there's much more in this, which I'm going to explain. So this also reflects the fact that in Japan, Filipinas can stay very long term on permanent residency. They don't feel the need to just become Japanese citizens because they actually qualify for many of the social services while being long-term legal residents. So we can just see this here. So this is in our sample. So what this shows is, the gray is Filipinas who are divorced. And orange is Filipinas who have been widowed. And what's quite sort of striking is that in Japan, just a much bigger percentage of Filipinas in Japan are divorced than in Taiwan and Korea. And this doesn't really reflect different rates of divorce. the divorce rates among cross-border marriages in Korea and Taiwan are very high. So what this shows is the ability of Filipinas to stay in Japan legally, even when their marriage breaks down, before even becoming permanent resident or acquiring sort of citizenship. And I'm arguing that, we just see this pattern because the Japanese the Japanese sort of institutions and legal structure for citizenship rights are less tied to women's reproductive roles. So it's much easier for divorced Filipinas to stay in Japan than in the other two countries. In the other two countries, you need a reason. Husbands, you have to provide a reason why your marriage broke down. And it has to be the husband's fault. If you're leaving your husband, then you don't get to stay. And even when you have a child, if the state sees that you're not a good mother, you don't get to stay either. And the Japanese state doesn't look into things like that. All that the Japanese state cares about is whether you've been lawful and whether you have a job to sustain yourself. So it's really interesting that a divorced Filipina in Japan can marry a foreigner and sponsor a visa for that foreign husband. That's something that would be very, very difficult to do in Korea and Taiwan. In Korea and Taiwan, they would only be able to do that if they're citizens. But in Japan, they can do that if they're permanent residents. So family reunification rights, all that's just much stronger in Japan. And the access to healthcare for long-term residents is much stronger in Japan than in Korea. So economic independence. Filipinas are much more likely to be active in the labor market than average Japanese women. And when they do work, so here there's some sort of differences across sort of labor markets that I haven't really mentioned. Taiwan is the most gender egalitarian sort of labor market. So we do see that when in Taiwan, a lot of women work, and when they work, they're more likely to work sort of full time. But it's also just noticeable that in Korea, despite all these sort of government sort of interventions, their sort of employment status is just much weaker, and they just complain a lot about feeling disadvantaged because they're foreigners. So I'll probably just sort of stop here, but let me just talk about two twists. So in Japan, it's really interesting that because the government many of the jobs have been closed to foreigners, elder care in Japan, it's not ethnicized. In many countries, elder care is just something that the migrants do, not in Japan. And today, there are Indonesian caregivers, Filipino caregivers who just come to Japan to provide care. But these people are categorized as skilled foreigners, and they get paid the same as sort of Japanese sort of citizens. So ethnicization of occupation, the patterns are very different between these sort of three countries. And it's very interesting that Filipinas, when they work, they tend to work in similar sectors that migrants work. So this means that Filipinas in Japan engage in work that in other countries migrants would do, but without the kind of the wage penalty of sort of migrants. So I'll just skip this. And so a quick takeaway. So what I find is that the Japanese government in Japan, sort of Filipinas have thrived much more than in Korea, despite the kind of the governmental neglect. They were not interested in them. But because of the kind of the precedent that exists in Japan. By the time Filipinas just come in, Japan had opened a venue for long-term legal residents to access social rights. So the constitution says that foreigners don't have social rights, but de facto in Japan they did. So this gives sort of Filipinas much more stronger access to de facto citizenship, whereas access to rights were much more conditioned on patriarchal kind of reproductive expectations in countries like Korea and Taiwan. So so my findings are just similar to that of Erin Chen and Deborah Midi, two Japanologists who have also just engaged in systematic comparisons of new sort of immigration countries. But there is a very ironical sort of twist. In a sense, these long-term sort of foreigners thrived in Japan because of something that's akin to the US military's don't ask, don't tell. They were not really interested, they didn't care about these, the married migrants. If they're married to Japanese, they're Japanese. Children, they're Japanese. But now, or even sort of long-term sort of the legal sort of residents, they get access to social rights, not because the LDP government wanted to. So this was kind of just a very sort of bottom-up change. And now that finally the national government is interested in immigration, they are starting to open up migration. So once they started doing that, they started talking about cutting back on foreigners' social rights. So again, I think that Japan would have had perhaps a better opportunity to integrate immigrants more successfully than Korea, perhaps. But their decision to bring in more foreigners is just coming with the decision to cut back on the very institutions that were helpful in integrating sort of foreigners. So it's interesting.
Okay, thank you so much. So we will follow the practice of asking one of the associates of the U.S.-Japan program to ask the first question. It's Nagisa Osaki-san who will be the first questioner.
Thank you so much for your fascinating presentation.
Please speak up a little bit.
I'm Nagisa Osaki, Associate of US-Japan program. I really enjoyed your comparative approach to migration and education. I'd like to ask a question about the relationship between these policy developments and the social structure. So Japan seems to differ from Korea and Taiwan in how it has developed its legal and institutional context for married migrants. So do you think this could be the delivery feature of Japan's closed political opportunity structure or its problem-oriented politics? In other words, has the quiet acceptance of married migrants allowed Japanese political leaders to address labor and care shortages while avoiding public backlash against expanding immigrants?
So do I take one at a time?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for a sort of great sort of question. Yes, so one sort of political structure is very different, right? So all these sort of policies about accepting that Korea now, the Korean family is multicultural, all these sort of multicultural policies, Taiwan says that it's a multi-ethnic society. So all these decisions just came from progressive presidents. Because Taiwan and Korea are much younger democracies than Japan, but they go through sort of periodic alternations in power. So progressive forces have been able to make policy decisions. So this is true of immigration policies too. So the decisions tend to come top down. In Japan, this just rarely happened because the LDP doesn't want to talk about immigration. So there is immigration in Japan, but they just don't want to talk about it. They don't want to talk about marriage migrants. They don't want to just talk about these colloquially, the Japanese do have terms like me. I'm half Japanese, half sort of Spanish. My mother's Japanese, my father's Spanish. So they would just use the term hafu. But the government doesn't use this term.
Okay.
Yeah.
David Howell, and then Nakano-san.
Thanks so much. I have either two questions or one two-part question. The first part is if you could say anything about when Filipino women are pondering moving to one of the three countries explicitly for marriage, what kinds of factors do they take into account when making their decision to go to Korea or to Japan or to Taiwan? And then the maybe second question is, and maybe it's just a stereotype, but my strong image of women from Southeast Asia marrying in Japan, and I think also Korea, is that they tend to move to rural areas where male farmers have just a lot of trouble finding Japanese women willing to become farm wives, and then go to the sort of kind of market of women coming from overseas. And at least with Japan, the idea that the LDP dominates in rural areas, which are the very areas where there be most of these migrants. Also, I mean, in some ways, to me, on the one hand, it kind of makes sense that the LDP politicians wouldn't really want to talk about it, but also not crack down on it. But also, I could also see them saying, embracing them more vocally as a reality of an increasing reality of life in rural Japan. And I suppose something similar is going on in Korea. I don't know about Taiwan.
And then Nakano-san, and then we'll ask you to answer those questions.
Thank you very much. Koichi Nakano from the US Japan program. I wonder, well, maybe one comment first. I'm still sort of thinking that all three countries sounds quite horrible in terms of, strength of patriarchy. And so I'm not sure whether, it's such a great idea to emphasize that Japan is not so bad, because it still comes across as very, very bad. And so it's a range of patriarchies in different shade, rather than, being more accepting of migrants in terms of adapting to change, from the answer you gave to Nagisa-san's questions as well. And having said that, I think, is the main difference between the three cases primarily have to do with the fact that in the Japanese case, it's much more of the economy being in crisis, whereas in South Korea and in Taiwan, the whole idea of the nation states are in crisis or have never been fully established, given that you talk about the co-ethnic groups, being there in the case of Korea and Taiwan, whereas in Japan, the kind of idea that one nation or one ethnicity equal the state continues to be so strong, and of course being emphasized by the LDP conservatives over the years, result in this set of policies in which the economy ends up becoming more open, but the citizenship continues to be very closed. And the idea of multicultural Japan is okay with regard to the economy, but not so much in terms of citizenship and all the kind of discrimination that multiracial kids and, the idea that you really have to be a pure Japanese in order to be admitted one, whereas Korea and Taiwan don't really have first, they have also, from what I understand, many more than the Filipinos, there are Chinese or Korean ethnic groups who come in to get married in the first place, which of course, if that was available to Japan, just like with the Peruvian, the Brazilian, Japanese, I'm sure the Japanese government would have done that too. That's one thing. But the other thing is that as long as they give birth to Korean kids or Taiwanese nationals, they are welcome to that degree. It's just a sort of an idea that I'll check with you.
Great.
So thank you so much. So yes, these Filipinos do just make calculations on where they want to go, and East Asia is not their first destination. So they do sort of calculate. So in the book, I have some sort of details, and I also just build up on just lots of ethnographies that exist. So for instance, a Filipina who just wants to make quick money would prefer to go to Japan as entertainer. But there's a market clearing system. So there are these employment agencies, and if you're too old, the employment agency would just say, you can't go to Japan to work anymore. Go to Korea. We'll just match you up with a husband, right? So there's a pecking order. And it's also just interesting that the governments have cracked down on marriage migration, all of them around the same time, 2005. So it's much stricter now. So in Japan, this was just done because of the US government, State Department, sort of complained that the Filipina entertainers were just like human trafficking, although these were active agents of migration. They were not victims, but because of the State Department pressure, Japan has had to crack down on this entertainment visa. And as soon as that happens, the supply of Filipina wives just goes down, but then the Chinese come in through other channels, so there is a kind of political economy of this. And now, so when entertainer visas were closed, the government of the Philippines cares about these things because they want remittance. So that's just around the time that the government of the Philippines signs a bilateral deal with the Japanese government. Japan starts to accept Filipino nurses and caregivers. Now, these are high-skilled women. Filipino nurses don't want to stay in Japan. They want to go work in Australia or Canada or the US. So these people are not going to marry Japanese men. So something sort of interesting just going on. So it's much more than just marrying rural women. There are lots of Filipinas in Shizuoka, sort of Kanagawa prefecture, so in Tokyo too, just lots of them in sort of Taipei. And again, Filipinas just relatively well-off sort of category. So rural men just find Filipinas too demanding. So they just think that Vietnamese women are just more
Viable.
Flexible.
so it's just kind of just a disgusting sort of marketplace. Okay, so Nakamura-san's just questions. Yes, it's this is different shades of patriarchy, patriarchy. But it's really interesting that, say, in Japan, patriarchy exists for Japanese women too. Okay, so Filipina wives are not having it worse than Japanese women. Whereas in Taiwan and Korea, the state doesn't impose this patriarchy on the native women. Native women just don't want this anymore, but the state is doing this to foreign women. So there is a difference. And again, as I said, I'm not saying that Japan's just a nirvana for migrants. And yes, whether sort of Japanese society is just more discriminating, non-discriminating, so this is just also just changing. I think once the issue just came up to the national politics, it kind of just gets more anti sort of immigration because of the sort of right, because right-wing politicians are very sort of vocal on this. But also, so Japan's kind of interesting that there's an interesting path dependence that Japan is the only colonial power of the three. The other two were Japanese colonies. So when the war ended, there were former imperial subjects of Japan residing in Japan, like Koreans and some Chinese. When the war ended, they just lost their Japanese citizenship. Many returned, but many also just stayed and they became foreigners in Japan. So the Japanese government didn't give them citizenship, but gave them a special status to stay in Japan long term and gave them access to social rights, although the Constitution says that only citizens have rights. So this kind of created a very different path dependence that the structure of sort of social citizenship was just very different in Japan than in Korea and Taiwan when these sort of maritime migrants came.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm Umio Jikoshi from Harvard Academy. So I have also a question about Japan is not so bad kind of argument, which is interesting. And I also understand that the argument is coming from the fact that like a citizenship policy in Japan is not strongly tied to the family reproduction. And then you also showed though that like a figure presenting basically a higher proportion of Filipino women in Japan, they are more divorced. Then that makes me wonder, you know, like the single mother's poverty is very high in Japan and higher than other OECD countries. And then if we look at the figure, on the other hand, on the one hand, you can say that because they have more autonomy, they have like they can be basically get divorced and they can still live in Japan. But on the other hand, the number tells you that maybe those women are very much in poverty. And then it's partly because of that, like they are more likely to be in the labor market than people in Korea and Taiwan, perhaps. So then I kind of wonder, do you have any information about economic kind of well-being among Filipino women in those three societies?
No, because in my survey, I didn't ask for income because that's just I don't. I could just probably just get some data on the Korean side because they have a good survey data. So less so with Taiwan. No, but the divorce is I talked to sort of immigration lawyers. Changing the visa status is much easier in Japan. So you don't have to prove what the reason for divorce was. Whereas sort of Korea and Taiwan just police this, much more. And yes, they might just not be affluent, but it's just really the legal structure is different. So there is a certain income threshold that you have to overcome to be able to just stay in Japan. Just some of these women just worked 2 jobs to clear the requirement, because you have to clear the requirement when you just get authorized. But it's the legal context is just very different. The fact that so I talked to a Filipina sort of married migrant, divorced. She worked 2 jobs so that she met the income requirement to be able to sponsor her Korean husband. I mean, you can't do this in the other 2 countries.
Can I just circle back quickly to David's question about, so if your vantage point, you're in Manila and you're a young Filipino woman and you're looking maybe to work, but thinking maybe you could meet a mate and so on. Is there a recruitment structure in Manila for this? And I ask this because if you go to Singapore and you go upstairs on Nathan Road, you find hundreds of offices when dozens of young women waiting to be interviewed to be placed. And so those recruiters are there recruiters who are telling people, well, your best bet might be Japan and actually Taiwan's not so great. And are there those people?
Yes, well, at least, that's what I've just seen in the ethnography. So I've, spoken to ethnographers too. But, just first they just want work migration. So they would just prefer to just come to places like the US and Europe, because then it's easier to find a legal job. And once, even when you're a domestic worker, if you're legally working they can bring their family. They don't have to marry a local.
But we're talking about the choice of the 3 countries you're looking at. And recruiters are sizing up these 3 destinations and giving recommendations.
Yeah. So they play the market clearing role, right? So you might just say, I want this job, but they'll say, no, you don't have a chance, but you can go there.
Okay, sorry, I'm realizing we have just a little tiny window. And is there anyone we'd like to include on our?
Yeah, so I guess we could do one question. There are two questions, but online. So I'll choose one question in a short version, which is that I'm curious if you think that Japan will take after the South Korea Taiwanese model that emphasizes the role of reproductive labor, given it looks up to Korea as, quote, more advanced, unquote. Additionally, South Korea has restricted marriage migration since 2010s. What has the trend in Japan been like? So is Japan moving towards South Korea Taiwanese model? And then has Japan restricted marriage migration just like Korea?
Yeah, they're all sort of restricting the second sort of question. So the marriage migration, well, from the Philippines have really sort of dropped. So in the three countries, but marriage migration overall hasn't declined as much in Korea as in the other ones. Will Japan just pursue the Korean and Taiwanese route in sort of labor migration? This is just something that Japan just cannot decide. People will want to come to Japan. So whether the number of foreign workers will increase in Japan or not, so it's not only just up to Japan. And Korea and Taiwan do have some advantages. Korea has this source of ethnically Koreans in China who are just willing to come. And also what Korea has been just doing is to tap into the Korean diaspora in places like the US and entice them to come back to Korea. Japan doesn't really have this. So yes, there are Japanese, Brazilian, Japanese, Peruvians, but Japan could entice Niseis, Sanseis or Yonseis in California to go back to, but then the wage structure doesn't, it's not really lucrative, right, for them to. So whether Japan can emulate or not, it's there is a kind of market forces that play out.
Yes. Well, I'm afraid we're at the end of our time, and the subject is so fascinating and very complex. Would you join me in thanking Margarita